Clap your hands if you believe in fairies, or if you just believe in fantasy. Peter Pan's favorite commands to the young hearts to save Tinkerbell will seem to tell us that the fantasy genre finds a whimsical way to pretend that the impossible and the fantastic are real. Some say the first fantasy film began in 1896 with Georges Méliès. Georges Méliès was a famous French musician who brought some of his magic tricks into film and created some of the very first special effects. He made one of the first fantasy films called Le Voyage dans la Lune, aka The Voyage to the Moon. However, one of the biggest breakthrough fantasy films came in 1933 with The Wizard of Oz. One of the biggest moments in this film is when the black and white of the usual films of the day break into dazzling colors. While color might not seem amazing to today's standards, put yourself as the audience in the 1933s, some of which see in color for the very first time. Another interesting take on the fantasy film happened in the 1920s by Mark and Dave Fletcher, who combined animation with live action, such as their film Coco the Clown, opened ways for other films such as Mary Poppins and Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
They were together. Was a new adventure in trouble.
Hide me, Eddie! Please!
It's a motion picture about
So what separates certain film genres, such as the fantasy film, from other films like science fiction? Why, take a film like Back to the Future. In this film, we have the scientist Doc Brown, who invents a time machine to travel through time. While this technique, he uses technology to make his time travel happen. A film like Back to the Future would be considered a science fiction film because it involves science and technology so that he could travel through time, as opposed to a film like Woody Allen's A Midnight in Paris. In Woody Allen's A Midnight in Paris, we see our main character Gil, who daydreams about life in the 1920s. In this film, we see a pagoda come by and pick up Gil and transport him to the 1920s. A film like Midnight in Paris is considered a fantasy film because there's no science or technology that explains how Gil travels in time. It is simply left up to the viewer's imagination. While in a film like Midnight, it may not even matter how he gets to the past, but it simply carries the story that he goes there in the first place. So what makes a fantasy film? Well, the fantasy film has to ask the question, what if? Rather than this is. Take a film like It's a Wonderful Life. While most of the film takes place in a set reality, there's a part of the film where a man asks the question, what if he's never been born? And in this film, an angel is able to grant that request and show him what it would be like if he had never been born. Another sort of what if question is in the film The Purple Rose of Cairo. In this film, we meet Cecilia, who has a fairly difficult life and finds escape in this film, The Purple Rose of Cairo. Cecilia watches the film several times, until one day, when the character on the screen notices Cecilia and literally leaps off the screen and decides to spend some time with Cecilia. While this film has much of it set in reality, it asks the what if question, as in what if one of the characters could actually come to life. Why some films have sure images such as the cattle drive in a western or the hats and cars of a gangster film, while the characters and icons in a fantasy film functions more like poetry that focuses more on a feeling or an emotion than a specific image. According to the British blogger Brian Sibley, he has a website that has dedicated to the conversations dealing with fantasy. He talks about in his blogs how fantasy is really the most primary source of fiction. He goes on to say that fantasy is one of the earliest stirrings of human imagination itself. For example, take Dorothy and her friends from The Wizard of Oz. They seem to validate this idea by singing lyrics such as, if happy bluebirds can fly beyond the rainbow, why, oh why can't I? Something like this famous song moment from The Wizard of Oz shows us that our imagination's always longing for something more, something out there, or in this case, something over the rainbow. In some ways, our very imagination begins with the fantasy. We see Dorothy longing for something more than this ordinary reality. We have several Disney films that seem to have mastered this concept of breaking away from reality. Even in the Walt Disney theme parks, we see that there's a certain amount of escape from reality. Disney theme parks, we could see adults spending all day in Mouse's ears. It's a way of breaking away from the average and everyday. Started with George Méliès, we have great fantasy films even today. Such films that go on to be such as Harry Potter or the Lord of the Rings saga, just to name a few. One of the issues that fantasy films help us deal with is the social problems of just escapism. Often, we find ourselves trying to get away from day-to-day issues and live in this fantasy world. So in the end, fantasy is whatever your imagination tells you it should be. It's really just whatever's way to escape from reality. It's a fun way to imagine you're someone else, go somewhere new, or do something unexpected. The fantasy film is much ways like a fantasy novel. It's just a good way to get away for a while, become someone different. Another place and another time. So really, anytime you're looking for escape, a great time just to sit down, grab some popcorn, and enjoy your fantasy film.
In the merry old land of Oz, we get up at 12 and start to work at 1. Taking out for lunch and then at 2 we're done. Jolly good fun! Ha ha ha! Ho ho ho! And a couple of tra-la-las. That's how we laugh a day away in the merry old land of Oz. Ha ha ha! Ho ho ho!